So recently, it might be entirely possible that I have a bit of an obsession with this AI dark fantasy trend that's been going around. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically a load of AI images that have been generated in the style of a 1980s dark fantasy movie. And it gives this really cool, like, grainy VHS vibe. And they're pretty much always set to this same awesome piece of music by Dorian Concept. So to try and scratch my dark fantasy itch, I thought it might be a cool idea to try and make a diorama inspired by this guy, because I just like his attitude. And our unfortunate knight in this piece is going to start life as an action figure, but more specifically, a Chinese knockoff of a fluted knight from Demon Souls. Now, normally, I don't condone buying imitation products, but in this case, because this guy's going to get roughed up a little bit and eventually get covered in paint, I couldn't really justify spending £150 on the Figma one, so I think I can put my video game action figure morals to one side, just this once. But my first job was to get this guy posed in a position that I quite liked and thought would suit the scene. And that meant I needed to cut, remove and attach a few pieces just until I had a look that I was happy with. And unfortunately for this guy, that also meant his head had to go. But luckily enough for him, that just meant I could replace it with this extra spooky 3D printed one. And this guy was going to need a base to live on, so I set to work cutting one out of a few pieces of XPS foam on the hot wire cutter. And just to mix things up a little, I decided to go with a round base this time, just to make sure we can show off that pretty little face from all angles.
You're mocking me, aren't you?
But then it was time to create the rest of the landscape, so using a Sharpie, I marked out a rough guideline on the foam to give me a bit of an indication of where I needed to cut to create my small ledge. And when I pictured this piece in my head, I had our fallen knight leaning up against a dirt ridge, maybe nestled in a few tree roots in the middle of a forest. So with all of that in mind, I used a bunch of different tools to cut the ridge into the foam. I just kept removing material until I had a look that I was happy with, and making sure that the figure still fit snugly in place. And with those steps completed, it was time to add the first layer of texture with a batch of sculptor mould. The sculptor mould is going to provide a nice protective layer for the foam against any glue and paints that we might add down the line. And it also gives me a chance to fill in any of those odd looking gaps around the knight's legs and his arms. And about 12 hours later, when everything had a chance to dry, I could then move on to laminating the sides of the piece with some veneer. I used a few strips of double-sided tape to hold it all into place, and then I made sure to fill in any gaps with a little bit of super glue. And that was the base just about ready for the next step. And that's going to be to add my dead tree and a whole bunch of tree roots to get this piece looking a little more foresty.
Run, Forrest, run!
And I had originally planned on using this cardboard tube as the base for my trunk, but turns out it's a little bit too big. So after some digging around in my maybe I'll use that one day box, I found this old wooden handle, which was pretty much the exact diameter that I needed. I just needed to cut off the ends to make sure I had a good fit.
A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later.
And after adding a couple of pins for some extra support, the tree trunk was ready to be fixed into place on the base with a little bit of super glue. And then I was left with a pretty good starting point for the rest of the terrain features. And the first thing on my list was to add some realistic looking roots to that tree trunk. And that was simple enough to do with a few dried twigs and roots and a few dabs of super glue. And once I had a look that I was pretty happy with, I could then move on to adding the texture to the tree trunk using some 2-part epoxy putty, or in this case, Milliput. Milliput's pretty perfect for jobs like this because it's really easy to sculpt, especially when you use a little water at the same time. And I find the easiest way to sculpt trees is to break it down into sections made up of little sausages.
Can we cook up some sausages?
Oh, I have wasps in my brain!
It's just a case of adding enough of these sausages until you get good coverage, and then you can introduce a few different tools to bring out the texture. I started with a soft paintbrush just to get the basic shapes that I was after, and then I added in the finer details with a hobby blade and an old airbrush needle. And I decided to use the leftover milliput to fill in some of those posable joints on the action figure. And once all the milliput had some time to dry, I could then move on to adding some dirt texture. And I decided to go with my tried and true method of AK's dark earth texture paste, topped off with some real dry dirt from my garden. Then I used some gravel and sand fixer from AK just to lock everything down in place. And once that had all had some time to dry, I was ready to move on to the next step and apply my first coat of paint to the tree trunk. But before we do that, there is one small problem that needs addressing with my workbench, and I think that problem is pretty obvious. I sometimes suffer from what I like to call mess blindness. Once I start making something and I get in the zone, I kind of lose track of what's going on around me, and before I know it, there's this great big mess piled up everywhere. So it was about time that I had a good tidy up and a refresh of my workspace. And lucky enough for me, I recently just received this care package from the good people at Hobby Zone. This modular workbench system is, well, it's actually perfect because I designed it on their website to fit the exact dimensions of my bench. And because they have a whole different host of options, I could specifically design the system to fit my needs in terms of the amount of paint I've got, along with my other bits and pieces. All the modules are machined from MDF and they snap together really easily. You just need to make sure you use a little bit of wood glue just to make sure they stand the test of time. And then after not too much time at all, you're left with a bunch of modules that are ready to be put together on your workbench. And it's at this point you can take advantage of fitting the magnets that are supplied with the modules just to make sure nothing comes loose. Then you can sit back and admire all of your extra organisation in all its glory. So huge thanks to Hobby Zone for setting me up with this awesome new workbench system. And if you're interested in getting a similar setup for your own workbench, be sure to check out the link to the website down below in the video description. And now my workspace was a little more organised, I could get back to painting. And I'm going to start by giving everything a coat of primer. I've gone for a deep brown mahogany primer for this step, and I'm going to give everything a coat, including the tree, all of the roots and all that ground texture. And this is going to leave me with a nice uniform base coat that we can start building on top of, starting with the tree. I applied a few earthy coloured green tones from Vallejo just to build up a little variation across the trunk and all of the roots. Then I applied some aged white from Vallejo as a sort of highlighting layer. Hopefully this is going to create some nice contrast when it comes to applying the washes. And for all of that dirt texture, I gave everything a really rough base coat with some of Vallejo's flat earth, before mixing in a little olive drab and just hitting all of those high spots to try and create some nice shadows. And once that had all had some time to dry, I could then move on to applying a few enamel washes to the tree to try and bring out some of that texture and create some more depth. I used a few different tones for this from AK, including dark streak and grime and some starship streak and grime. Once these two tones get blended together with a little bit of white spirit, you're left with a really nice effect. And then I moved on to applying this same logic to the rest of the dirt texture. So darker washes in the darker areas underneath the tree, and a few of the mid-tones on top of the high points. And it was at this point that the scene wasn't really looking as busy as I'd imagined, so I decided to add a few more bits and pieces, like these natural dried out tree roots that just got held into place with a little bit of matte Mod Podge, and a few extra twigs across the floor just to create a little bit more interest. Then it was just a case of blending everything in with some more of those enamel washes. And after a quick dry brush with some more of that flat earth from Vallejo to bring back the highlights, I was just about ready to work on the ground cover for the forest floor. And the bulk of this ground scatter is going to be made up with some of this organic potting soil. I'll mix in a few other bits and pieces like this wargaming sawdust scatter, along with some dried natural crushed leaves, just to create a few more interesting textures. Then it was just a case of scattering the scatter across the piece until I had good coverage and a look that I was happy with. Then it was back to the gravel and sand fixer, just to make sure everything was permanently locked into place. And while that took some time to dry, I could then turn my attention to painting the action figure. And as I like to point out in all of my other videos, I am not a very good painter. So, as usual, I'm going to be fumbling my way through this, so feel free to point out in the comments how much of an idiot I am and what I should have done differently.
What an idiot! Oh, what a loser!
But as a starting point, I thought it would be a good idea to get a base coat of gunmetal down, and then give all of the armour plates a dry brush with some light silver, just to create some variation and texture. And because I like to think this guy's been chilling in this spot for a while, his armour's going to be pretty old, weathered and rusty. And I'm hoping that some typhus corrosion from Citadel is going to help me achieve this look. I started by applying it in the deeper recesses, where naturally the water might pool up over time. Then using a damp clean brush, I just cleaned up the effect around the edges to make it appear a little more natural. Then I applied a 50-50 mix of Agrax Surfshade and some Fire Giant Orange Speed Paint from the Army Painter, just to tie everything together and take the edge away from that metallic shine. Then it was time to try and emphasise those rust effects, starting with some Fur Brown from the Army Painter. This layer should hopefully act almost like a base coat for each of the rust patches, and it gets applied in a stippling motion in sort of the darkest areas of the typhus corrosion. And once that had all had some time to dry, I then moved on to the next effect, which was a pigment powder wash made up with some isopropyl alcohol. The first layer was made up of some of Vallejo's old rust pigment powder, and then the second layer was with some rust oxide just to brighten it up and really enhance that rusty matte look. And I just made sure to apply a smaller amount with each layer just to really build up that contrast. And after tying all of that together with a little light rust enamel wash from MIG, I could then move on to dry brushing on some of the original silver colour just to make the edges pop. And that was my efforts to make weathered armour plate, and I'm pretty happy with it. It's going to be another case of it'll do.
I mean, it's alright, like, overrated as fuck in my opinion. I mean,
then I painted all of the other features in a pretty simple but effective way. I did most of this off camera just to save your sanity, and to be honest, mine as well. But all things considered, I managed to get it done pretty quickly and he was pretty much ready to go. And I also made sure to apply the same weathering techniques to the helmet and this extra fancy 3D printed sword. And conveniently enough, all of the ground scatter was now dry, so we can now move on to adding some foliage. And what's the first thing that comes to my mind when adding green stuff to a forest?
Moss, is it not?
Thick blankets of moss in forests are pretty common, and when it comes to modelling, it can be a pretty eye-catching feature. And luckily, it's pretty easy to recreate with a little bit of matte Mod Podge and some crushed foam. In this case, this is burnt grass from Woodland Scenics. And I knew from the start of this project that I wanted this to be a pretty mossy forest. So after covering most of the tree roots and the fallen branches, I added in a few mossy blankets across the ground and worked my way up the tree. And once that had all had some time to dry, we were left with this pretty cool looking result. But the beauty of crushed foam is that it takes paint really well, so we can enhance the look a little bit further and give that moss a little more contrast and depth. You just need to make sure you really water down your paint, because the crushed foam is then going to absorb it like a sponge. Then it's just as easy as working through your colours from darkest to lightest, just making sure to apply a little less paint with each layer. And while the moss takes some time out to dry, we can concentrate on adding some more foliage with these products from Gamer's Grass. I've used these laser cut plants a whole bunch of times on different projects, just because they're really easy to use and you always get great, instant, consistent results. And I think they look even better when I use them alongside some of these natural plants from Diorama Precipe. And as a bit of a finishing touch, I also decided to print out and paint a whole bunch of these tiny mushrooms. I feel like they're going to help break up the scene a little just by adding a few splashes of colour in and amongst the rest of the foliage. And once I've finished with my little mushroom planting session, I could then move on to tidying up the sides with some black gesso, just to help finish off and frame the piece. And the last job on the list was to finally lock in place our fallen knight in his final resting spot. And I think that means there's just about enough time for a few glamour shots. So that's going to do it for this video, and I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's taken the time out of their day to sit and watch through this. I haven't really uploaded as much as I'd like lately, but to be fair, I have got an excuse. I've been a bit preoccupied introducing my new baby boy to the world, so hopefully things are settling down now, so regular uploads should resume. Let's hope. But as always, I just want to say thank you everyone again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.